This craving for wrongful or undue exaltation is the root or the seedbed of all human sin. They went on from there and passed through Galilee, and he did not want anyone to know, for he was teaching his disciples, saying to them, "The Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him. And when he is killed, after 3 days he will rise." But they did not understand the saying, and were afraid to ask him. And they came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asked them, "What were you discussing on the way?" But they kept silent, for on the way they had argued with one another about who was the greatest. And he sat down and called the 12, and he said to them, "If anyone would be first, he must be last of all and servant of all." And he took a child and put him in the midst of them, and taking him in his arms, he said to them, "Whoever receives one such child in my name receives me. And whoever receives me receives not me, but him who sent me." John said to him, "Teacher, we saw someone casting out demons in your name, and we tried to stop him because he was not following us, or he was not following with us." But Jesus said, "Do not stop him, for no one who does a mighty work in my name will be able soon afterward to speak evil of me. For the one who is not against us is for us. For truly I say to you, whoever gives you a cup of cold water to drink because you belong to Christ will by no means lose his reward." So as we dive into the passage today, the first thing that I'd make note of is the fact that the tone of the passage just seems to be making an ominous shift. It seems to be shifting from just the recent brightness and upbeatness of the Transfiguration, which of course was coming on the heels of so many healing miracles, casting out demon miracles, making the waters calm miracles, multiplying food miracles. Just on the heels of that, of course, we encountered the ugliness of the story of unbelief at the bottom. But beginning from the passage now, it seems as though just everything about the journey that Jesus is on just seems to make a dark shift, an ominous shift. A foreboding sort of mood comes over this. As we read that they went on from there, meaning the place where they had this discussion with the scribes and the boy that the disciples couldn't cast the demon out. From there, they went on and passed through Galilee. Now, that's the last time that Jesus will be in Galilee, and it's the last time we will hear of Galilee in Mark's gospel, which is to say, except, of course, in Jesus' prediction, as he says to the disciples, his instructions of meeting him in Galilee after his resurrection. But aside from that, Jesus will not be in Galilee again, and we will not hear of Galilee again. And that's even doubly ominous for us, seeing that Jesus was, of course, from Galilee. So he's passing through his hometown. And passing through his hometown, we're told that he did not want anyone to know that he was there. So as he passes through, not wanting anyone to know, clearly this implies for us that at least the crowds are somewhat smaller. For Jesus to pass through his hometown region and be able to pass through not being known seems to imply to us that the crowds are thinning. The disciples that are following him are fewer, but he wants to pass through his hometown, not even stopping, not even seeing anyone, not even saying hello or goodbye to any of his friends, but to pass through Galilee, not being seen or not being heard. Furthermore, in verse 33, they're going to come to Capernaum, and that will be the last time that we hear of Capernaum in Mark's gospel. Capernaum, of course, is the hometown of Peter and his brother Andrew. And in Capernaum, they're going to go into what's called the house, the definite article, the house, which implies to us that the house that's in question there will be Peter's house. So perhaps they will enter into Peter's house. Perhaps verse 33 will take place in Peter's house. And perhaps this will be the last time that Peter sees his family, at least before that very terrible and awful night in which he will deny knowledge of his Savior, and that awful night in which Jesus is arrested and tortured. So Peter is there. Perhaps he and Andrew are there, and perhaps that's the last time he'll see his wife. We would assume he has a wife. He has a mother-in-law. Does he have children? We don't know, but perhaps this will be the last time that he sees them. And so you just feel sort of the forebodingness coming over. Jesus is on this journey, and we know where the journey is headed to because we know the story. But Mark's reader doesn't yet know where the journey is going to because Mark hasn't told us yet that he's on his way to Jerusalem and what will happen in Jerusalem. But we know that because we know the rest of the story, as Paul Harvey used to say. We know the rest of the story, and so we know that this story is the story of a journey, of a trip, and the destination is Jerusalem, or more specifically, the destination is Golgotha and the cross on Golgotha. So he goes there, he passes through Galilee in secret. He did not want anyone to know. Why did he not want anyone to know? Verse 31, for he was teaching his disciples, saying to them. So Mark tells us that the reason Jesus wanted to remain incognito is because of the subject matter that Jesus was busy teaching the disciples at this time. Because of this teaching, because of this sensitivity, because of the nature of this teaching, Jesus desires to remain incognito. And the teaching is this: the Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him. And when he is killed, after 3 days, he will rise. So there's the substance of the teaching. This is what Jesus is busy teaching his disciples. This is the second time. Remember, in this section here, there are these 3 instances in which Jesus will teach of his coming arrest and death and crucifixion and resurrection. And all 3 of these instances, if you remember, as we began this section, we made note of the fact that all 3 of these instances will take place in the distinct context of the disciples' misunderstanding and sinful self-exaltation. And so this one takes place in the context that's about to follow, the context of the discussion over which disciple is the greatest. Nevertheless, this is the subject matter that Jesus is teaching them. The Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him. Now, if you're reading this morning in the NIV has the unfortunate translation of betrayed. The Son of Man is going to be betrayed in the hands of men. I think the New Living, if you also use that, also has the word betrayed. So this is translating a word that literally means to hand over or to give over, which in many contexts is a proper translation to be translated betrayed. However, betrayal carries with it the sense of deceit, of deception, of a traitor betraying one of his own over. And we know this will happen to Jesus. Jesus will be betrayed into the hands of men by one of his own, by Judas. However, we should be careful to note that betrayed is not a proper translation at this point because Jesus is not being betrayed. Jesus is being handed over, as the word literally means. So Jesus is teaching them he is going to be handed over. Now we have, unfortunately, a poor translation of the verb tense there when we read he is going to be. In our English Standard, he's going to be handed over. So the verb there, our translation implies a future tense, but it's not future tense. It's just simply present, passive, indicative. So literally, Jesus says the Son of Man is turned over or is being turned over. So here's what Jesus is teaching them. Jesus is not teaching them of some future event when one of his own, Judas, will betray him into the hands of men. Jesus is not saying, one of you is a devil. One of you is going to betray me. That will happen, of course, but all 4 Gospels make it clear, or at least they clearly imply, that a change comes over Judas when in Jerusalem. In that last week of Jesus' life, a change comes over Judas, and that's when his plans are made. At this point, Jesus is not teaching his disciples, there's one of you that's starting to betray me. You're starting to sense a disillusion, and the idea of betraying me is beginning. That's not what Jesus is saying at all. Jesus instead is not speaking of his betrayal by one of his own. He's speaking of the work of the Father to turn him over. Jesus is saying the Father's work of turning me over, of handing me over into the hands of sinful man, that work has begun. That is why we cannot stop here in Galilee. That's why I don't have time for the hometown folks here in Galilee. That's why we won't be delayed right here, because the Father's work of handing me over into the hands of sinful men has begun. And so you can see clearly there that betrayal is not an appropriate translation, because the Father does not betray the Son. The Father hands over the Son to the hands of men because that was the plan of the Father, the Son, and the Spirit from eternity past. The plan of the triune Godhead was that the Son would be turned over to men, but in turning Him over, the Father's not betraying the Son. The Father's not deceiving the Son. The Father is not acting traitorously towards the Son. It is the plan of the triune God for Him to be turned over into the hands of men and to be killed, and after 3 days to rise. So the giving over of Christ to men has begun. It is underway. Now, verse 33. What we begin to see at verse 33, I've entitled this section, the jarring juxtaposition, the stunning, stunning contrast. Verse 33, and they came to Capernaum. And when He was in the house, He asked them, what were you discussing on the way? Or literally, what were you contending with one another on the way? What was the subject of your argument on the way? But they kept silent. For on the way they had argued or contended with one another about who was the greatest. So you see clearly this incredible juxtaposition, this stunning contrast, that as the Son of Man is literally on His way to be handed over, to be tortured, to be executed, to be hung upon a cross, humiliated and shamed. While He's on His way to do that, the disciples, who've been a study all along in misunderstanding, non-understanding, a study in spiritual dullness, the disciples are contending with one another among which one of them would be the greatest in the kingdom that is to come. So you see this stunning contrast, and Mark wants us to see it that way. Mark wants us to see this and just be shocked at what a contrast we see on the road of here is the humility of the Son of Man, and those who are following behind Him are contending with one another over which of them would receive the greatest honor or the first place. So an incredible juxtaposition as He goes on. So as they are traveling here, they go to the house. We might assume that might be Peter's house or maybe someone else's house. In the house, He asked them this question. What are we discussing? What are we arguing about? Now, Jesus, of course, knows what they were arguing about. He doesn't need the information from them. And once again, we're just shocked at the disciples, at their lack of perception, at their lack of insight. Because in my mind, I picture this scene of they're walking along the trail, along the road, and here's Jesus sort of leading the way. And then maybe back at the end of the little entourage of disciples, maybe there's several of them way back in the back, and maybe they're talking in sort of hushed tones, having this discussion over who's the greatest. Now, what sort of criteria were they using? How were they assessing who's going to be the greatest? That's completely unknown to us. Maybe they were discussing who would cast out the most demons, or who was Jesus' favorite, or who does Jesus always send into the village ahead of Him, or who knows. Whatever it is, they're sort of having this discussion, thinking, surprisingly, that they're having a discussion in private. They should know by this point that their thoughts are not hidden from Jesus. They should know that no matter how quietly they speak, or no matter how far they are back from Jesus, they should know that their thoughts are not secret from Him, but they kept silent. Because now the shame comes upon them, the shame, the embarrassment that comes upon them as they now think, He knows. He knows what we were talking about. He knows that. And so they have no answer to give Him because they were arguing who was the greatest. So here we see really the nub of the passage, and the central issue that we deal with in this passage is the issue of human pride. Now, human pride is that fundamental sin within the human heart. We could define it a lot of different ways, but especially for our purposes today, I think perhaps the most helpful way to think of human pride, or the most helpful definition to give to human pride, is this. Human pride, fallen human pride, is the human craving for undue exaltation. The human craving for undue or unjust or unrighteous exaltation. The human heart, the fallen human heart, craves exaltation. And pride is the craving for undue or unwarranted or wrongful exaltation. And so you can see here in the context of the passage how the disciples are craving undue or unrighteous or wrongful exaltation, because they're arguing over which of us is the greatest. Now, they desire this exaltation, and the exaltation that they're desiring is a wrongful exaltation. And this craving for wrongful or undue exaltation is the root, and we can think of it this way, is the root or the seedbed of all human sin. We could think back to the garden, and we could think that, well, clearly that's what takes place in the garden as the tempter comes to the woman and tempts the woman with this temptation of exalting herself. You know, you don't need God. You can be like God. You can take of this fruit and you can be like Him. You see the self-exaltation, the undue exaltation. But it even goes back further than this. If you listen just for a moment, this is not in your notes, but if you listen just for a moment from the prophet Isaiah chapter 14. In Isaiah 14, Isaiah is proclaiming God's woe or God's wrath against the kingdom of Babylon. But remember, there's this theme in Scripture, and the theme is the theme of Babylon, the kingdom of Babylon, as being synonymous for the kingdom of evil. And so the king of Babylon, Isaiah is proclaiming this wrath against him, or God's judgment against him, but in a larger way, God is proclaiming His wrath or His judgment against Satan, who is the ultimate king of Babylon. So listen to the words of the prophet. You, speaking to the king of Babylon, but by way of the king of Babylon to Satan, the prophet says, you said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven above the stars of God, and I will set my throne on high. I will sit on the mount of assembly in the far reaches of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. Do you hear there the craving for undue exaltation? As Satan is craving in his created heart, in his angelic heart, he's craving an exaltation that was not due him or not rightfully his. And his craving of that exaltation is the sin of pride. And that's the very thing that he comes to the woman with. And that is, like I say, in a very large sense, the root or the seed of all human sinfulness is a craving for a type of exaltation that is not due unto us. And so the ugliness of what we see here on the trail, the ugliness of this, I think we can all agree. This is something that when we see in our own heart or when we see in the others around us, it is one of the ugliest aspects of humanity. This craving for undue exaltation or human pride.